Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
Thank you. This is Doug King, and we are back, and I am here with my trusted partner, Mr. Cody.
Oh, yeah. I am glad to be back. That last one.
Yeah.
Woo! Man.
Started cooking.
Come on.
Yeah.
Yep. So I'm looking forward to really starting to kind of pull the layers back a little bit on all of this. I think it was the setup was very intriguing, particularly the background that I came from.
Yeah.
And to come from kind of a left behind type theology, it's really, really intriguing to be able to jump into some of this and pull these layers back and figure out what the narrative maybe giving some winks and nods to. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And, we talked last week, we put our foot in the water with the spiral. We were talking about eschatology as it applies to the spiral.
Yes.
A couple of elements we didn't hit on were the fact that as you're moving up the spiral, it is dealing with both the individual and the collective. One of the books that we've got in the show notes for the day that I think you might find helpful if you're not familiar with the term quadrants. It's actually in the work of Claire Graves and Don Beck talking about quadrants, and it was popularized by Ken Wilber as well. And so we reference, Cody and I have a theory of everything by Ken Wilber. It's a small paperback. It's an easy read. And there's a whole section in there about the quadrants.
And actually, the first time I saw, so the map of spiral dynamics is obviously incredibly helpful, and even your listeners would know, yes, this has been helpful for my own growth and evolution. But the first time I saw the four quadrants, again, another map that kind of opened my eyes, not only to my own individual evolution,
yes,
but the tribe of people that I'm leading and navigating, even at Vinings Lake, as a pastor, the collective.
Yep.
Oh, all the light bulbs started going off.
Yes.
And then don't even get me going on the artifacts and the upper left, upper right, lower left, and lower right. So you want to look at that in the show notes because it's really, really helpful.
Yeah, it's very helpful. And just quickly to kind of set the stage for all of that, the ability to have an integral perspective of existence, who am I, does begin with me as an individual. So when you're looking at the quadrants, you'll see that the upper two quadrants have to do with the individual. But because I am not an island, no man is an island, I also am who I am in relation to all others on the planet. They also greatly impact my viewpoints and the way I understand things. And so the bottom two quadrants are for the collective. Then you'll also note on the diagram that both the individual and the collective have an internal and an external.
Oh, see, I already know where this is headed, and I'm liking it already. Internal and external.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about that for a minute.
Yeah, so as we are traversing this journey on the planet in the realm of form, we have also an internal consciousness as a human being. I have internal consciousness. That's all my thought understandings, my paradigms in my head, the way I see the world as an individual is in my consciousness. And then what I'm seeing and how I understand things is related to my external. So, for example, in just integral theory, you might have internal consciousness of the individual, and that's in that upper left quadrant, and that would be a whole universe that would be occupied by people who are psychiatrists, therapists, psychologists. That universe is all about the upper left, which is the internal human consciousness. When you move over to the upper right, we're talking about the external of a human. So literally, I might say that my brain is the external functioning of my internal consciousness. So over there I might have a neurologist, and it's the field of neurology. But it could also be anything external that either is my entire body and the way my body works, or it could be things that I make as an individual, what I'm manifesting as an individual that are external things. And then, of course, when I move down to the collective, we have a different universe in the lower left, and that is the internal consciousness of a collective. That's ideologies, belief systems, and actually spiral dynamics would be, and when you look at the levels of consciousness, those are called worldviews, right? Well, worldviews would be held by a collective, so that's the consciousness, the internal consciousness of a collective. And then you were talking about artifacts and things that are made. That is over in the lower right, because that's what we do as societies. Societies make things. And so if you are in the field of, say, archaeology, you'd be over there in the lower right, and you might be digging up arrowheads and pottery shards.
Yeah.
And that's telling you a little bit about a culture. And from those external things, you can start putting together and surmising what their internal consciousness was.
Oh, my good Lord. So it's almost like, okay, Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit.
Yes.
It's almost like the lower right is the fruit of the evolution of the lower left, the collective consciousness. As it evolves, so you'll see the fruit also evolving.
Absolutely.
Point example, iPhone.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like as culture has moved forward, so the things they produce has shifted in Tesla, dear God.
Yes.
Tesla, a friend of mine just got one, by the way, whole other side note. Mind-blowing.
Yeah.
To me, so the lower right mirrors the growth and evolution of the lower left.
Yes.
Okay, so you talked about, in the spiral then, to bring it back, individual and collective.
Yes, absolutely.
Internal and external.
Yes.
Now, when it comes to individual and collective, okay, real quick, give us an example of like the stages of consciousness in first tier. What would be one that's individual and one that's collective?
Yeah, so that's a great point. As you look at spiral dynamics, the people like Don Beck and others are going to point out that actually we go in and out of self-expressive stages to collective expressive stages. So, for example, the archaic level is very much about the self-expressive stage. When you move to tribal, you are then moving to a collective worldview. When you move to warrior, you're back to self-expressive and an emphasis on the self. When you go to traditional, that's all about the empire, loyal subject of the empire, which is meaning that you are part of a collective. When you go into orange is modernity. That's the entrepreneur. That's the inventor. It's all about the self-expressive again. And then when you go into post-modernity, it's all about the collective. Hey, we need to be more inclusive. We need not to marginalize people. We need not to discriminate. And it's all about the collective. So there's this back and forth in the trajectory of spiral dynamics, because any collective movement or worldview is going to start with one, two, or a handful of individuals. And it always starts that way. And that's why if you are in the minority or no one is thinking what you're thinking right now, that could actually be a really, really good thing. It could mean that actually, rather than stagnating into an idea, concept, belief system that is no longer workable, or that can grow into a much deeper, richer level, you're one of the ones who are willing to stand up on the front end and say, I'm seeing something that's even greater than that. That's what has happened through all stages of history. Usually, though, in the world of religion, the only problem is they try to kill you.
Speaking of killing.
Right.
Great segue. Okay, what does the individual and collective have to do with the subject of hand, eschatology?
Yeah, so that's a great question because we want to bring it to the biblical narrative. If, in fact, that is what integral theory says, gives us a full integral view of our existence, that it requires that we understand all four quadrants of that, or we'll become a reductionist, which means, as I have often said, it's like having that grocery cart that has that funny place on the wheel, and you're going through the grocery store, and that dadgum cart keeps clicking along, and it won't run smoothly. So that's why you can't leave out any of those quadrants. In the biblical narrative, when we're looking at eschatology, we're looking at the individual, which would be Jesus of Nazareth, and we're looking at the collective, which would be his body. Now, both of those are absolutely necessary for an integral look at the transformative process, which is the eschatological process. And the reason I'm bringing that up, some people might be listening and going, well, duh, yeah, of course, that makes sense. However, within modernity, there have been a number of theologians, and even some denominations will focus purely on the cross. And they will say the only thing we really need to understand is Jesus and the cross.
Right.
Now, if you're in integral theory, they're going to say, well, that's an absolute foundational part of understanding spiritual identity because the cross is both an upper left individual and upper right individual event. However, what about the collective? You've left out the body. In essence, you've just decapitated the head, Jesus, from the body. There's going to be some problems there.
Yes, because they are together.
Yes, they work together. And one of the things I think a lot of people, Cody, don't really think about is the fact that Jesus and the cross event is the beginning of the end. It is eschatology. It is eschatology.
Wow. So when you talk about eschatology, the study of end times, example, this letter called Revelation.
Yes.
Lots of people read that, which is a whole other conversation, but they're like, oh yeah, that writer John, he was just thinking about the year 3000.
Yeah, exactly.
You're saying if we're going to have a conversation about end times, well, we need to start with this individual named Jesus.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because Jesus is going to be called the firstborn, one, singular. And so what's happening is you're going to have this cross event. So if we just go ahead and think about the aspects of the cross event from Jesus of Nazareth, the individual, you've got three basic aspects there. One is the crucifixion itself.
Right.
That Jesus goes to the cross and endures that crucifixion itself because Jesus' faith has taken him there. What is his faith? His faith is that God is on the other side of the cross event. His faith is that rather than maintaining the form that had existed for centuries preceding him, rather than placating all the people that were putting pressure on him to stay within that form, Jesus was saying that he was going to go beyond form, and that is why he became transform.
Come on. Which, by the way, again, these show notes are important.
Yes.
Because if you're looking at the Venn, you see the cross.
Yes.
Right on that line between form and transform.
Yes.
So this is why, by the way, there is a crucifixion, right?
Absolutely.
Because when you're breaking through boundaries, you're going to get killed.
Yes, you have to be willing for something you have attached to. You have to be willing to let that die.
Yep.
That is an extremely painful process, even if we're talking about our belief systems, especially if we're talking about our belief systems. You know, you've got to let something die, something that has defined you and the community in which you live, worship, have social life, friends, etc., etc. If you start talking about letting those kinds of things die, it is immediately going to raise the question, well, now who am I? Now who am I? So the cross event's first aspect is that aspect of crucifixion, that Jesus is dying to form. And the reason that happens is because, first of all, form played a role in function. You could not, as a human being, understand anything unless things were put into categories like forms: the day and the night, the ocean, the land, and the air. And so all these creation elements that we have in Genesis 1 are form things. What happens in the beginning? It's void and without form. So what's God got to do? God's got to put it into form so we can understand how it all works.
Good Lord, Doug. And so, 2 creation poems, Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah.
He's separating forms.
Yes, exactly.
Come on.
So that's now the thing is that is an initial consciousness stage. It's not the end of the story. That is required at the beginning of humans growing up. But it later becomes a problem if, in fact, I attach to, or if people attach to, form as their ultimate God identity. And so if you're thinking of it in terms of God identity, form was everything that we will see in a minute, internal and external, related to boundary-driven thinking, because you got to have boundaries around a form. And if you attach to that, that becomes your identity. Jesus, therefore, is dying to form. What is required in form? The self as source. Why? Because who can keep the form properly? Who can keep the law properly? You as a person, as an individual. It's all about you, self as source power. Jesus is putting the self to death on the cross, and that's the impact of it. It means that Jesus is dying to form attachment, which requires doing. And so Jesus is dying to doing, he's dying to form attachment, he's dying to self as source. And so the crucifixion is that first phase. Now, there's also a reason why Jesus was in the tomb. Second aspect is he's in the tomb 3 days. That's a symbol that says there's no question, no doubt, that Jesus was completely without any power as self in that tomb. There is no more powerless situation for me or any human being than if you are lying in a tomb. You, through self as source, can do absolutely nothing. And so the 3 days in the tomb was to emphasize the fact that, in fact, Jesus was lying in a state of death, complete death to that form, no ifs, ands, and buts about it. He was dead to that form. But then the third aspect is the manner in which Jesus comes out of that tomb. That, of course, is the aspect of resurrection. Being raised up is a concept. And so to be raised up for Jesus, because he has an external body, Jesus's body was crucified on a cross biologically, it went into a grave biologically, and it was raised out of that tomb biologically. Why? Not because that is the nature of what all of his followers were going to do, because to be a follower of Jesus, no one was expected to go literally be crucified. Rather, what it was showing was the source of true identity is God, because every time the resurrection of Christ is spoken of in the narrative, the writer, especially Paul, is going to say, like in Romans 1, Paul will say that Jesus was raised by the power of God. So the whole point of the body coming out of the tomb is to say this is a symbol that the only power that exists in the universe, the only thing that's ever going to happen in my life that's going to be sustainable, that's going to bring me actual happiness, peace, abundance, is going to be all of those things that I allow to come through me by God power. Not through self. Myself is going to attempt to take control. Myself is going to attempt to, through my own hands, my own doing, but it's never going to work. So those are the 3 aspects of Jesus individual.
Whoa.
Yeah. Other than that, there's not much to it.
Okay. So I want to talk, so 2 things. Self as source and spirit as source. Could you, in fact, look at the New Testament writers and they use, for an example, Paul?
Yeah.
He would say, the things I want to do, I don't do.
Yes.
And the things that I do are the very things I don't want to do.
Yes.
And he kind of gives this metaphor of there's this battle between, but he uses this language, the flesh and the spirit.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying when you talk about self as source and spirit as source?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because when you're talking about self, you're always going to see that in the narrative related to human doing. Paul will tell the Philippians, for example, that through doing, he realized after his encounter with Jesus that he was attempting through doing to have what he called a righteousness of his own, which is self as source. And when you're talking about what Paul was going through in Romans 7, the thing that I would do, I do not, and the very thing I would not do, that I do, notice that everything centers around the word do, that when you're in a doing body, which is to say when you're in an identity that is based on doing, then everything you attempt to do is a self-righteous action. But what is it that you want? You want God identity. Mm-hmm. Your very doing is the very thing that is against God identity. God as source is the only way that you're ever going to have identity. So that if you hold on to the law and doing, the very thing you would do, have God identity through doing, is the very thing you don't do. And the very thing you would not do, be separated from God through self as source, is the very thing you end up doing. That's what the law causes. And so it puts you in this predicament. And that's why Paul at the end of the chapter says, who will deliver me from the body of this death? That was a death body because it was a body based on self as source and doing. And the only way Paul was going to get out of that was to be transformed into a whole new state called formlessness.
And drop mic. Boom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Internal, external.
Yes.
This archetypal pattern of death and resurrection. I need to speak about that for just a second because
sure.
You see this pattern even throughout creation. And this is where it's really interesting to me. So think about winter and spring. It's like winter, everything dies, and in spring, new life springs forth. Think about our bodies. 300 million cells die and are replaced every minute. Food that we eat. Something was either a plant or an animal, but it died to give us life so that we can have substance. It's interesting to me that Jesus, like he makes statements periodically, like he's just like, hey, take up your cross and follow me. It's almost as if he's inviting us also on this archetypal pattern of dying and rising. So it's interesting. Jesus never said, I find this interesting. Jesus never said, like, worship me. He said, follow me.
Right.
So he's like, hey, go down this path of dying and rising, which I got this whole little kick how to shrink a church, like as a pastor. I always say, I'm like, if you want to grow like a mega church, tell them to worship Jesus. But if you want to shrink a church, like tell them to follow Jesus.
Wow.
Because it's because that's not really the message you want to hear.
Right.
It's like, oh yeah, death, resurrection. But what I love, Doug, and this is what's so exciting, is that to me, that's like when the old is buried, that's death, the new arises.
Yes.
When the old has died, the new springs forth. When old things pass away, something new explodes into existence.
Yes.
And that's resurrection.
Yes, absolutely.
And so that works both on the internal and external, both the individual and the collective.
Yes.
And so when you talk about that, because that's Jesus the individual.
Yeah.
And obviously external body.
Right.
For those that are like bodily resurrection. Yeah. But then let's talk about the collective for just a few minutes. What does that look like in the context in this archetypal pattern of dying and rising?
Yeah, exactly. And to your point that you just wrapped up on as far as Jesus and the cross, bodily resurrection out of the tomb was an external sign of a greater spiritual reality, just like the crucifixion was. In other words, the narrative is not saying if you want to please God, you need to go out and be crucified bodily on a cross. And the narrative is not saying that someday in the future, you're bodily going to come up out of a grave just like Jesus did. See, neither one of those apply to the collective or to what's going to happen after that in history. That's a unique time in history that was unique to Jesus of Nazareth.
Oh, good Lord, Doug. Well, we should probably talk about that some other time too, like a bodily resurrection.
We'll get to it
because that's also in the conversation of eschatology.
Of course, it is.
Yeah.
I mean, we're gonna get to that infamous resurrection of the dead.
Yes.
And again, that's going to be a topic that some people talk about a lot, and it's going to be a topic that others, usually the more progressive Christians, they don't like to talk eschatology, and they sure don't like to talk about what in the world is the resurrection of the dead. What is that? So yeah, we will talk about that and not get off the subject today.
Totally.
By doing that. But it is to say that you did have literally Jesus being externally in a body that was a sign. Jesus said, I will give you one sign. Well, that sign was what happened to the body. And so it was necessary. Now, when we get down into the collective is going to start entering into the kingdom of God from the standpoint of spirituality. And spirituality, as we move from form to transform and formlessness. Formlessness is spirit. When we start moving into spirit, we have to think in terms of symbol. So it's not that the body of Christ or those that follow Jesus are literally going out to be crucified.
Right.
That's the first aspect, is crucifixion.
Right.
So for them, if we were to go to, say, Romans 6, Paul's going to talk about baptism, and baptism is an external practice of somebody being dipped in water. There's some place of water's external, you go in the water, and so you're baptized, but that is a symbol. That's not literally that the water itself makes you somehow or another something that you weren't before. That symbolizes that you are being crucified with Christ. So they had to have something that was a symbol of being crucified with Christ, because they weren't obviously going to be literally crucified. And then the second aspect, if we remember, Jesus was dead in the tomb for 3 days, and that symbolized that Jesus was absolutely dead. There wasn't any question about his death. What's interesting about the second aspect of death, living out death, how did the collective show that they had died with Christ? How did they show that over a period of time? For Jesus, it was 3 days. We'll see for the collective, it's about a 40-year period. It's that generation, that collective. And the way they did that, one of the ways was what Paul talked about to the Corinthians when he talked about the Eucharist meal. And he said to them, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. This, again, is the second aspect. Just as Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days to verify that he had died, genuinely died, no question about that, to the previous order of form, so also the collective was taking this Eucharist on a weekly basis as a meal that showed that they themselves had died to the old just as Jesus had. So that's the second aspect of this. And that is basically their tomb time. Now, there's a third aspect to this, but Cody, I think we've already run out of time on this podcast, man.
Well, first of all, I know your listeners and myself, I need to process for just a little bit. So probably a good place to kind of wind this thing down. So just to bring it back home, eschatology is, for us, is not something that's necessarily in the future. It's something that started with this cross. And so we're talking about first tier to second tier, this dying to first tier, this rising to second tier, dying to self as source and rising to spirit as source. And this is just the start of eschatology. So I think with that said, we'll wrap it up, and hope all of our listeners have a fantastic week, and we'll jump back into eschatology next week.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.